They came for Earth's leaders. They got Churchill Downs on Derby Day instead, 40,000 people, $200 million in bets already placed. And one horse named Thunder Biscuit who had never lost a race, and was not about to lose his first war either. The ships came down low over the infield, right as the bugle played, right as the horses loaded into the gate. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. A man in a seersucker suit looked up, looked at his mint julep and said, "Well, that's gonna mess up the exacta, if you want to see how the fastest horses in America." A few thousand drunk racing fans, and one very angry blacksmith took on an empire that conquered 6 worlds. Stick around, because this story does not slow down. Smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and drop a comment telling me which horse you think wins this war. Now let's go to the starting gate, because the real race is about to begin. The Vex Collective had studied Earth for 11 years before they decided to invade it. 11 years of satellite footage, intercepted broadcasts, and careful analysis of human behavior. Their war council had concluded that humanity was fractured, slow to organize, and emotionally unstable. They had also concluded, based on repeated viewings of a single viral video, that horse racing was a sacred religious ceremony where humans gathered to worship a 4-legged deity. This was not entirely wrong. It was also not entirely right. Either way, the Vex Collective decided that the first day of May, the day of the largest gathering of humans at a single American site outside of a holiday weekend, was the perfect day to begin their conquest. They would land during the most important race in the country, paralyze the crowd with fear, and broadcast their dominance to the entire planet at once. It was, on paper, a brilliant plan. Their commander, a tall and heavily armored being named Gorath Vey, had personally selected the location: Churchill Downs, Louisville, Kentucky. The 152nd running of the Kentucky Derby. Gorath did not know what a derby was. He knew it involved animals, large crowds, and something called a mint julep, which Vex intelligence had incorrectly flagged as a possible chemical weapon. He had prepared for resistance. He had not prepared for Dale Tucker. Dale Tucker was 61 years old and had worked the backside of Churchill Downs for 38 years. He was not a jockey. He was not a trainer. He was a farrier, the man who shoes the horses, and he had hands like cracked leather and a back that could still lift an anvil without complaining about it. On the morning of the Derby, Dale was in barn 41, finishing up on a colt named Hollow Point when the sky turned the wrong color. He did not look up right away. In 38 years at the track, he had learned that most things that seemed urgent were not, and most things that seemed unimportant usually were. He finished the last nail, set the colt's hoof down gently, and only then looked toward the grandstand. 6 ships, black as wet asphalt, descended over the infield like they owned the place. They did not own the place. Dale knew who owned the place. It was the horses. Inside the grandstand, panic tried to start and failed almost immediately, because the public address system was still playing the post-parade music. And nothing about a string quartet allows for proper panic. People stood up, people pointed. A toddler asked her father if the spaceships were part of the show. Her father, a man named Roy Prout from Lexington, said, "I don't think so, sweetheart, but stay close to me," in the same tone he would have used if a thunderstorm was rolling in. Roy had been coming to the Derby for 22 years. He had seen rain delays, he had seen a streaker in 2003, and he had seen a horse refuse to load into the gate for 45 minutes. A spaceship was new, but it was not going to ruin his day, dang it. The lead ship landed directly on the infield grass, crushing a flower bed that had taken the grounds crew 3 weeks to plant. The ramp lowered. Gorath Vey stepped out first, flanked by a dozen Vex soldiers in dark-plated armor, each one carrying a weapon that hummed with blue light. He raised a device to his mouth, and his voice boomed across the entire grandstand in English, translated by a system that had clearly learned the language from old cowboy films. "People of this land," Gorath announced, "your civilization now belongs to the Vex Collective. Resistance will be met with force. Surrender your leaders." There was a pause. 40,000 people stared at him. Then from somewhere up in the grandstand, a man's voice shouted back, "We don't got leaders, we got a governor. And he's at the Oaks party." Laughter rippled through sections of the crowd before nervousness caught back up to them. Gorath did not understand the joke, mostly because there wasn't one, not really, just a Kentuckian responding honestly to an absurd question. His soldiers fanned out across the infield, weapons raised, scanning the crowd for what their tactical computer labeled as command structures. The computer found none. What it found instead was 8,000 people holding small paper cups of bourbon, 1,100 enormous hats, and absolutely zero chain of command, because horse racing fans do not organize. They simply show up and yell. Back in Barn 41, Dale Tucker set down his tools and walked to the barn door. He watched the soldiers spread out near the track rail, close to where the horses were being loaded for the biggest race of their lives. That was the moment his mood changed from concerned to something colder and more focused. These animals had trained their whole lives for this one race. Some of them would never run again after today regardless of what happened, and now there were armed strangers standing close enough to spook them. Dale picked his hammer back up. Not because he planned to fight with it, he just liked having it in his hand when he was thinking. Down at the gate, the horses were already loaded, already nervous from the noise and the strange ships, already feeling the tension running down the reins into the jockey's hands. Thunder Biscuit, a 7-year-old chestnut gelding who had not lost a race in 2 years, stood in gate 4 with his ears pinned flat and his eyes rolling white at the corners. His jockey, a small, fierce woman named Carmen Ruiz, leaned forward and whispered something only the horse could hear. Whatever she said, it worked, because Thunder Biscuit stopped fighting the gate and instead locked his eyes forward, toward the track. Toward the open grass beyond the rail where one particularly confused Vex soldier was now standing directly in the path of where 20 half-ton animals were about to be released at full speed. Gorath Vey raised his weapon toward the grandstand again, preparing to make his next announcement. Behind him, completely unnoticed, the starting bell for the 152nd Kentucky Derby rang out across the racetrack. Nobody on the Vex Collective's tactical team had accounted for that. 20 horses came out of the gate like the ground itself had exploded. 8,000 pounds of muscle and momentum hit the open track at nearly 40 miles an hour, and the noise alone, that rolling thunder of hooves, was something the Vex soldiers had never trained against. Their sensors registered the herd as a single massive heat signature, moving at a speed their threat assessment software did not have a category for. The lead analyst back on the command ship typed furiously, trying to classify it. The closest match the system offered was ground vehicle unknown propulsion, the soldier standing nearest the rail. A young Vex trooper named Ren Dahl, who had been so proud to be selected for this mission, looked up just in time to see a wall of horseflesh coming straight at him. He did the only thing his body allowed. He froze. Thunder Biscuit, locked into his rhythm and not caring one bit about alien invasions, clipped the soldier with his shoulder as he thundered past, sending Ren Dahl cartwheeling into the infield rail with a clatter of armor. The horse did not break stride. Carmen Ruiz, his jockey, did not even look down. She had a race to win. The crowd, who up until this point had been frozen between fear and disbelief, suddenly had something familiar to hold on to. A horse race. They knew how to watch a horse race. The screaming changed from terror to something closer to a roar. The normal Derby roar, just layered now with a strange electricity underneath it. Roy Prout, still holding his daughter's hand, found himself yelling at the top of his lungs for post position 4, because old habits do not die just because the sky is full of spaceships. Gorath Vey watched his soldier get launched 15 feet through the air and made a decision that would define the rest of his day. He ordered his troops to secure the track. This was, by any measure, the worst order he could have given. Vex soldiers moved toward the rail to block the horse's path, weapons raised. Expecting the animals to stop the way any sensible creature would stop in front of armed beings, radiating obvious authority. Racehorses, however, do not process authority. They process movement, noise, and the herd instinct bred into them across centuries of selective breeding for exactly one purpose, which is going forward fast and not stopping for anything. 4 soldiers lined up along the rail near the first turn. 20 horses came around that turn at full gallop, and the soldiers' carefully formed defensive line dissolved into a scramble of bodies diving in every direction. One Vex trooper was clipped across the back by a trailing horse's hindquarters and sent rolling into the infield pond that the grounds crew kept for decoration. He surfaced a moment later, covered in algae, his weapon completely waterlogged and useless. In the broadcast booth, the longtime track announcer, A man named Wally Hutchins, who had called every derby for the past 19 years, did not stop calling the race. He had decided, somewhere in the chaos, that the show must go on, and also that he simply did not know what else to do with his hands except keep holding the microphone. And they're coming around the turn, Thunder Biscuit on the outside. 2 lengths back is Hollow Point, and folks, I want to point out. There appear to be hostile aliens attempting to interfere with the race. Security personnel are advised, and Thunder Biscuit does not care one bit, ladies and gentlemen. That horse is flying. Dale Tucker was already moving. He had cut through the backside paths that 38 years of experience had taught him better than any map. Heading toward the rail near the first turn where he knew the horses would be at their most vulnerable, bunched together and committed to their line. He arrived just as a vexed soldier, recovering from being trampled, raised his weapon toward the approaching pack, not to fire at the horses specifically, but simply because his training told him an armed response to an oncoming threat was appropriate. Dale did not think. He swung his hammer, the same hammer he had used on 6,000 horseshoes over 4 decades, and connected with the soldier's weapon arm hard enough to send the blue glowing rifle skittering across the dirt. "Not today, partner," Dale said, in the same calm voice he used when a nervous colt tried to bite him. "These horses got somewhere to be." The soldier, stunned and now weaponless, stared up at a 61-year-old man holding a blacksmith's hammer like it was the most natural thing in the world. Around them, the race thundered on, unconcerned with the small drama happening at the rail, because horses do not stop for diplomacy, and they certainly do not stop for invasions. Back at Vex Command, watching through a damaged but still functioning drone feed, Gorath Vey's tactical officer delivered an update that did not improve anyone's morning. "Commander, 3 squads report disabled equipment. 1 unit is unaccounted for. Local fauna is, still racing." Gorath stared at the feed. On it, 20 horses thundered toward the far turn, completely indifferent to the 6 alien spacecraft sitting in the infield, while thousands of humans screamed encouragement that had nothing to do with surrender and everything to do with betting odds. "Local fauna," Gorath repeated slowly, "is still racing." "Yes, Commander." "Why?" The tactical officer had no answer for that. Because there is no answer that makes sense to someone who has never understood horse racing, or Kentucky, or the specific stubbornness of a state that names its biggest party after a hat. Gorath made his second mistake of the day. He ordered a squad to move directly onto the track itself, to physically block the final turn and force the race to stop, believing that once the animals halted, the crowd's spirit would break along with it. It was, in theory, a reasonable strategy. In practice, it required 6 armored soldiers to stand in the open path of 19 remaining racehorses running at top speed, with absolutely no intention of stopping for anyone, let alone a row of confused-looking beings in black armor. The lead horse, Thunder Biscuit, was still in front. Carmen Ruiz saw the soldiers forming a line ahead of her and did not pull back on the reins. She had ridden through loose horses, through track invasions by overeager photographers, through one memorable incident involving an escaped peacock from the infield gardens. She leaned low over Thunder Biscuit's neck and gave him the only instruction that mattered. "Go on through." "Baby." The soldiers ahead saw 20 half-ton animals bearing down on them at nearly 40 miles an hour, and made the only logical decision available to beings who valued staying alive. They scattered, not in formation, not according to any military doctrine taught anywhere in the galaxy. They simply ran, diving over the rail into the infield grass into each other, weapons forgotten, dignity abandoned. The horses thundered past without slowing, without caring, without the faintest idea that they had just routed an alien invasion force more effectively than any human weapon could have managed. The grandstand exploded into the loudest cheer Churchill Downs had heard in years. And somewhere in the chaos, Gorath Vey realized, for the first time since arriving on this planet, that he had badly underestimated what he was dealing with. Thunder Biscuit crossed the finish line 4 lengths ahead of the field, and for about 3 full seconds, the entire grandstand forgot there were alien invaders in the infield, and simply lost their minds the way derby crowds have lost their minds for over a century. Carmen Ruiz stood up in the stirrups, fist raised, and the track photographer, a woman named Denise who had photographed every finish line for the last decade, took the picture purely out of muscle memory, even as a Vex dropship circled low overhead. It would later become the most shared photograph in the history of the internet. A jockey celebrating a Derby win while an alien ship hovered in the background looking, for lack of a better word, confused. The celebration did not last. Gorath Ve, humiliated and furious, abandoned any pretense of diplomacy. He ordered his remaining forces to fan out across the track grounds and secure the grandstand by force, soldier by soldier, section by section. This was the moment the day stopped being strange and started being dangerous, because frightened, embarrassed commanders make worse decisions than confident ones, and Gorath was both. Dale Tucker, still holding his hammer, moved through the backside barns rounding up help the only way he knew how, which was loudly and without much patience for hesitation. "Boys, you can stand there gawking, or you can come help me get these animals somewhere safe," he shouted into barn 42, where a cluster of grooms and exercise riders stood frozen near the wash racks. One of them, a young groom named Petey Calhoun, who had only been working the backside for 8 months, asked the obvious question. "Help how, Dale?" "They got guns that glow, and we got 2,000 horses and about 11,000 pounds of farm equipment between us," Dale said. "I like our odds better." It was not bravado. It was math, and Dale Tucker had never in his life been wrong about horses. Meanwhile, in the clubhouse, Roy Prout had gotten separated from his daughter for nearly 90 terrifying seconds during the panic, found her again clinging to a security guard's leg, and was now doing what every father in Kentucky would do in that situation, which was getting his family somewhere safe, and then immediately trying to figure out how he could help. He was not a soldier. He owned a hardware store in Lexington, but a hardware store owner in Kentucky knows things that matter on a day like this. He knew, for instance, that the maintenance shed behind the grandstand was full of equipment used to groom the dirt track, including several pieces of machinery that were essentially small armored vehicles with very large rotating teeth on the front, designed to break up packed earth. Roy looked at the Vex soldiers advancing across the infield. He looked at the track groomer parked nearby, engine still running from earlier morning prep work. He made a decision that surprised even him. "Stay here with Mrs. Albright," he told his daughter, pointing to a kind-looking older woman nearby who nodded immediately and pulled the girl close. "Daddy's gonna go borrow something." The track groomer, it turned out, handled remarkably well when driven directly at a line of alien soldiers who had never once trained against farm equipment. The Vex tactical computer, scanning the approaching vehicle, classified it as unknown ground unit, moderate threat. Recommend evasive action, which translated in practice to 6 soldiers abandoning their position and sprinting toward the tote board for cover. Back in barn 41, Dale Tucker and a growing crowd of backside workers, exercise riders, hot walkers, and one extremely committed valet parker named Frank who had wandered over out of curiosity and simply never left, organized themselves into something resembling a plan. It was not a military plan. It was the kind of plan that gets made at a kitchen table or over a fence post, built entirely out of common sense and stubbornness. They would move the horses to safety first, because nothing else mattered if the animals got hurt, and then they would use whatever was lying around the backside, which on any race day included chains, lead shanks, pitchforks, and at least 4 functioning all-terrain vehicles, to make life difficult for anyone trying to stop them. This is where Thunder Biscuit re-entered the story, because a winning racehorse covered in sweat and adrenaline does not simply stand still and wait to be told what happens next. Carmen Ruiz had walked him back toward the winner's circle when the second wave of Vex soldiers arrived to secure the area, and Thunder Biscuit, still keyed up from the race and now smelling the same strange chemical scent that had been on the soldier he had clipped earlier, did not appreciate having armed strangers crowd his space. He reared, struck out with his front hooves, and caught a Vex soldier square across the chest plate hard enough to dent it, and send the man sprawling backward into the winner's circle flowers. The same flowers that were supposed to go around the winning horse's neck in about 10 minutes. Carmen did not try to stop him. She had learned a long time ago that a good racehorse has better instincts than most humans, and right now those instincts were telling Thunder Biscuit that the strangers in black armor were a threat. And a Derby-winning thoroughbred dealing with a threat is not a gentle experience for anyone involved. Word spread fast through the backside, not through radios or phones, because cell service had gone down the moment the ships landed, jamming every signal in a 5-mile radius. It spread the old way, person to person, shouted across barn aisles and over paddock fences. The horses are fighting back. Dale's got a plan. Get to barn 41. By the time the sun reached its highest point over Churchill Downs, something had shifted in the air over the racetrack. The Vex Collective had landed expecting a quick, humiliating conquest of a divided, frightened population. What they found instead was a backside full of farriers, grooms, exercise riders, and stubborn Kentuckians who had spent their entire lives working with animals that outweighed them by half a ton and never once been afraid of it. Gorath Vey stood at the edge of the infield, watching his soldiers regroup in disarray, watching the track groomer still circling like some kind of mechanical predator, watching a chestnut gelding stand defiantly in the winner's circle, as if daring anyone to come closer. He keyed his communicator and contacted the command ship in orbit. "Send reinforcements," he said, "and send someone who understands what we are actually fighting." The voice on the other end paused. "Define what we are fighting, Commander." Gorath looked out at the track, at the horses, at the people, at the chaos that no Vex intelligence report had ever prepared him for. "I don't know yet," he admitted. But it bites back. The reinforcements arrived an hour later, 3 more dropships descending over the backside stable area, carrying nearly 40 additional Vex soldiers, and more concerning, a pair of armored walkers, 6-legged machines built for clearing resistance on conquered worlds. Gorath Vey had requested someone who understood what they were fighting, and what the collective sent instead was simply more of the same force, doubled down. Because the Vex had never lost a planet by sending too many soldiers. They had simply never invaded Kentucky during Derby Week. Dale Tucker watched the new ships descend from the doorway of Barn 41, surrounded now by nearly 60 people from every corner of the backside. Grooms, hot walkers, exercise riders, 2 retired jockeys who refused to sit this one out. 3 large animal veterinarians who had brought their tranquilizer dart equipment, just in case it proved useful against something other than a panicking colt, and Frank the valet Parker, who had found himself a hard hat from somewhere and seemed determined to see this through to the end. "They're bringing the big stuff now," said one of the exercise riders. A wiry woman named Connie Marsh, who had broken more bones falling off horses than most people break in car accidents, and considered none of them particularly significant. "Those walking things look like they mean business." "Everything means business until it meets something it can't outthink," Dale said. He was looking past the walkers, toward the horse paths that connected the backside to the main track. An idea was forming, the kind of idea that only makes sense to someone who has spent 4 decades learning exactly how an animal weighing half a ton thinks, moves, and reacts under pressure. The walkers advanced across the infield grass on their 6 insectal legs, scanning for resistance with sensors built to detect organized military formations, weapon signatures, and defensive positions. What the sensors picked up instead, moving in loose, unpredictable patterns across the open ground, were 40 thoroughbred racehorses that the backside crew had deliberately released from their paddocks the moment the walkers touched down. This was Dale's idea, and it was either brilliant or insane, and as it turned out, it was both. A frightened or excited herd of racehorses does not move in any pattern a tactical computer can predict. They cut diagonally, they bunch and scatter. They change direction on a half-second's notice for no reason any outside observer could name. The walkers' targeting systems, built to track and engage organized infantry, struggled to process 40 independent objects moving at racing speeds in directions that made no logical sense. Because horses do not run logically, they run on instinct, and instinct does not care about being predictable. One walker locked onto what its sensors classified as the largest threat signature, which happened to be Hollow Point, the colt Dale had been shoeing that very morning. Now galloping flat out across the open infield with his ears pinned, and his tail streaming behind him. The walker's main weapon charged and fired, a bolt of blue energy that scorched the grass 3 feet behind the colt's tail as he cut sharply left at the last possible second. An evasive move he had learned purely from years of training to avoid other horses on a crowded track. The shot missed entirely and struck the second walker's leg joint instead, sending it staggering sideways into the dirt with a screech of damaged machinery. "Would you look at that?" Connie Marsh said, grinning despite herself. "They're shooting each other." The crowd in the grandstand, far from evacuating as Vex Command had originally hoped, had instead settled into something between a riot and a tailgate party. Security and police had given up trying to clear the stands once it became clear the safest place in Louisville right now was anywhere with 40,000 witnesses, and a television broadcast still. Somehow running. Wally Hutchins, the track announcer, had not stopped his commentary for even a minute, narrating the chaos below with the same professional enthusiasm he reserved for stretch runs and photo finishes. Folks, I have called 19 Kentucky derbies, and I want to go on record saying I have never, not once, seen a Colt outrun an alien war machine, and yet here we are. Hollow Point just embarrassed something that came from outer space, and the crowd is going wild. Listen to that. Roy Prout, having returned his borrowed track groomer and reunited fully with his daughter, found himself standing near the rail with dozens of other fans. All of them now treating the unfolding battle the way they would treat any close stretch run, leaning forward, shouting, gripping the rail with white knuckles. His daughter, 8 years old and apparently unbothered by the existential weight of an alien invasion, tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, is the horse winning? Looks like it, sweetheart." Gorath Vey, watching from the command position near his lead ship, finally understood the scale of his miscalculation. His soldiers had trained for urban combat, for orbital assault, for breaking the will of organized resistance forces across a dozen conquered worlds. None of that training accounted for an enemy that did not fight back with weapons, but instead simply refused to behave like a target. The horses were not attacking the Vex Collective. They were running the way they had always run, the way they had been bred for centuries to run. And in doing so, they were dismantling an invasion force that had no framework for processing chaos without structure. Gorath made his decision. If the animals could not be predicted, they would be removed from the field entirely. He ordered every available unit to converge on the backside stable area, the source of the herd, and capture or eliminate the horses at their source before they could cause further disruption. It was, in hindsight, the worst order he had given all day, because it meant sending nearly 40 armed soldiers directly into the one place on the entire racetrack grounds where Dale Tucker and 60 of the most stubborn, capable, animal-savvy people in Kentucky had been waiting for them the entire time. The barns went quiet. Connie Marsh checked the lead shank wrapped twice around her hand. Frank the valet parker adjusted his borrowed hard hat. Dale Tucker picked up his hammer one more time and looked toward the approaching line of soldiers cutting across the training track, getting closer with every second. "Showtime," he said quietly. Nobody argued with him. The Vex soldiers hit the backside stable area expecting an empty stretch of barns and a handful of frightened civilians. What they found instead was an ambush built entirely out of farm equipment, common sense, and 40 years of accumulated horse sense that no military academy in the galaxy had ever bothered to study. The first soldiers through the gap between Barn 40 and Barn 40, one ran straight into a line of horse trailers parked nose to nose, forming a wall too tall to climb quickly and too solid to shoot through, without wasting valuable charge on their weapons. Behind that wall, Connie Marsh and 2 other exercise riders were waiting on horseback, not race horses this time, but the steady, unshakable lesson ponies, used to calm down nervous thoroughbreds before workouts. Animals that had seen every kind of chaos a backside could produce and considered very little of it worth panicking over. The riders came around the end of the trailer wall at a controlled canter, lead shanks swinging, and the soldiers, already disoriented by the noise and the smell of 40 barns full of animals, broke formation trying to avoid being run down by horses that, frankly, were not even trying very hard. Dale Tucker had positioned himself near the feed room, where stacked bales of hay gave him cover and a clear line toward the main aisle. When the first soldier rounded the corner, weapon raised, Dale didn't hesitate. He swung a lead shank like a sling, the heavy brass snap on the end catching the soldier across the wrist and sending the weapon flying into a water trough with a hiss of steam. Behind him, 3 grooms emerged from the shadows of the tack room and tackled the disarmed soldier to the ground. Pinning him with the same efficient teamwork they used every morning to handle a colt that did not want its temperature taken. Across the stable yard, Petey Calhoun, the young groom who had asked Dale how exactly farm workers were supposed to fight alien soldiers, found his answer the hard way and discovered he was better at it than he expected. He had armed himself with nothing more than a pitchfork and a deep, abiding stubbornness, about protecting the horses he had spent 8 months learning to care for. When a Vex soldier cornered him near the wash rack, Petey did not freeze. He swung the pitchfork in a wide arc, more to create distance than to actually strike anyone, and the soldier, unfamiliar with farm tools and unwilling to find out what one felt like up close, backed off just long enough for 2 veterinarians to arrive with tranquilizer darts, originally meant for an uncooperative stallion. The darts worked on Vex soldiers about as well as they worked on horses, which was to say very well indeed. And within seconds, too, more soldiers were sitting on the ground looking confused and increasingly sleepy. Gorath Vey, monitoring the chaos from a secure position near the main grandstand, watched his forces collapse for the 3rd time that day and made the decision that would end the battle. Though not in the way he intended. He decided to lead the final assault himself, certain that his personal presence and superior training would finally turn the tide against what his censors continued to insist was simply disorganized civilian resistance. He marched directly toward Barn 41, flanked by his last 6 uninjured soldiers, weapon raised, fully expecting the sight of their commander to break whatever remained of the human resolve. What he did not expect was Thunder Biscuit. The Derby-winning gelding, still wearing the blanket of roses someone had hastily draped over him before the chaos resumed, had wandered loose from the winner's circle sometime during the fighting, drawn by the noise and commotion back toward the only place on the grounds that smelled like home. He came around the corner of Barn 41 at a full trot, ears forward, nostrils flared, directly into the path of Gorath Vey's advancing line. Carmen Ruiz, who had been searching frantically for her horse through the chaos, arrived just in time to see what happened next and would later describe it to reporters as the proudest moment of her career, prouder even than the win itself. Thunder Biscuit did not run from the alien commander. He had just won the biggest race of his life. He was full of adrenaline. And he had already decided earlier that day that strangers in black armor were not welcome near him or the people he had grown to trust. He reared up, front hooves striking the air, and came down directly in Gorath Vey's path with the full weight and fury of an animal bred for exactly this kind of explosive, decisive power. Gorath raised his weapon, but Dale Tucker was already moving, having sprinted the length of the barn aisle the moment he saw what was unfolding. He hit Gorath from the side with his shoulder, knocking the alien commander's aim wide just as Thunder Biscuit's hooves came down, narrowly missing Gorath's helmet but catching the weapon itself, crushing the barrel against the dirt with a crunch of twisted metal. The remaining soldiers, watching their commander get bowled over by a farrier and nearly trampled by a horse wearing a flower necklace, made the same decision their comrades had made in the forest hours earlier, across countless other failed invasions throughout history. They ran. Gorath Vey lay in the dirt of Barn 41, covered in mud, his weapon destroyed, his soldiers scattering, and looked up to see Dale Tucker standing over him with a hammer in one hand and a calm, almost sympathetic expression on his face. "Son," Dale said, "I don't know where you're from, but around here we don't take kindly to folks scaring the horses." Behind him, Thunder Biscuit snorted, shook his rose-covered neck, and went back to grazing on a patch of grass near the barn door, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just personally ended an alien invasion. By the time the sun set over Churchill Downs, the Vex Collective had withdrawn entirely from Louisville. Gorath Vey, recovered enough to walk but not enough to feel anything close to dignity, was escorted back to his ship under what could generously be called a surrender, and less generously be called a very strong suggestion from several hundred backside workers, racing fans, and one extremely persistent group of grandstand regulars who had organized themselves into a perimeter using nothing but folding chairs and sheer stubbornness. The remaining dropships lifted off just after dusk, carrying away an invasion force that had arrived planning to conquer a planet and left having been outmaneuvered by horses. The official reports, when they eventually came out weeks later through channels nobody fully understood, painted the picture in language that sounded almost apologetic. Local resistance proved unexpectedly coordinated. Animal life exhibited unpredictable and effective evasive behavior. Civilian population demonstrated significant improvised combat capability, using non-standard equipment. None of it captured what had actually happened, which was that an empire that had conquered 6 worlds had picked the one place on Earth where nobody was afraid of getting their hands dirty. and where the animals had been trained for generations to be faster, braver, and more stubborn than anything that tried to stand in their way. Churchill Downs reopened 3 days later, track repaired, infield flowers replanted. The broken sign near the clubhouse entrance fixed with fresh paint that still smelled faintly of varnish during the next event. Dale Tucker went back to shoeing horses in barn 41 because somebody had to, and because 38 years of habit does not break just because you happen to have helped repel an alien invasion on a Saturday afternoon. When reporters from every major network in the country tried to get him to describe what it felt like to fight off an advanced alien military force with a blacksmith's hammer, Dale simply shrugged and said the same thing he told anyone who asked him about a difficult horse. Wasn't nothing special. You just don't let anything mess with what you're responsible for. That's the whole job. Carmen Ruiz won an award she never expected, presented not by the Racing Commission but by a grateful city council, for what they called extraordinary composure under interplanetary pressure. She accepted it gracefully, then immediately deflected all credit to Thunder Biscuit, who received his own honor in the form of a permanent stall plaque and an extra ration of his favorite peppermint treats for the rest of his racing career. He did not seem particularly impressed by the recognition, mostly because he was a horse, and horses care considerably more about peppermints than plaques. Roy Prout took his daughter home that night, and when she asked him on the drive back to Lexington whether the aliens were going to come back, he thought about it carefully before answering. The way a good father does when a question actually deserves a real answer instead of a quick reassurance. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, "but if they do, I figure we'll handle it about the same way. Together and without losing our heads about it." She seemed satisfied with that answer, mostly because she had already moved on to asking if they could stop for ice cream, which, given the day they'd had, seemed like the most reasonable request in the world. P.D. Calhoun stayed on as a groom, eventually working his way up to assistant trainer within 2 years, and he kept the bent pitchfork from that day hung on the wall of his tack room office, telling the story to every new hire who asked about it, usually with slightly more embellishment each time he told it. Connie Marsh went back to exercising horses every morning before sunrise, same as she had for 20 years, and when people asked her about fighting off alien soldiers on horseback, she usually just laughed and said falling off horses was scarier, and she'd done plenty of that. As for Gorath Ve, the official Vex collective record of the failed invasion was eventually leaked, years later, through channels that remain unclear to this day. It contained a single line, buried near the end of an otherwise dry tactical summary, that historians and conspiracy researchers alike have quoted ever since. The commander's personal notes, attached as an addendum, read simply, "Recommend this world be left alone. Their animals are faster than our weapons, their farmers are tougher than our soldiers, and their children ask better questions than our analysts. We are not equipped for a planet that races for fun and fights for free. The Kentucky Derby has been run every year since, without incident. Though longtime fans will tell you the security around the infield got noticeably more serious the following spring. And that Churchill Downs quietly added an entire new wing to its facilities for what the official paperwork vaguely described as agricultural contingency planning. Nobody who was there that day needed it explained any further than that. Every May, on the first Saturday of the month, when the bugle calls and the horses load into the gate, there's a moment of quiet across the grandstand right before the bell rings. The same quiet there's always been, the kind that exists right before something fast and unstoppable gets set loose. And maybe somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in whatever passes for a galactic strategic command center, somebody still pulls up the old footage of that Derby day. Watches a chestnut gelding wearing a flower necklace stomp on an alien commander's weapon, and decides once again that Earth, and especially Kentucky, is simply not worth the trouble. If you made it this far, you already know this story deserves more than a quiet ending. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest for you. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. And share this with somebody who needs to know that sometimes the toughest defense a planet can have is a barn full of stubborn people, and a horse that refuses to lose. We'll see you in the next story.